The world economy is still globalised. At least it was at the point of recording this podcast. But superpower rivalry and the decay of global rules and norms means that geopolitical tensions are deepening, and global maritime trade is being caught in the crossfire, both literally and figuratively. Some of this is happening in plain sight. In the Red Sea, the Houthis redirected maritime trade, and the combined naval forces of Europe, the US, UK, Israel, well, they were unable to convince the majority of shipping that freedom of navigation had been maintained. In the Baltic, coastal states are publicly threatening to detain ships considered to be an environmental or security threat as a shadow war of pipeline and cable sabotage plays out beneath the waves. Strategic choke points from the Arctic to the Panama Canal are subject to daily diplomatic spats, and harassment of merchant shipping in the Taiwan Strait, the Black Sea, South China Seas. This is all now considered to be so routine that incidents are barely even reported. Behind closed doors, meanwhile, a legal and diplomatic war is being waged to redefine the very concept of international rules that allow ships to trade internationally. Trade lanes on the ocean are a contested zone for the first time since the Cold War. The very concept of freedom of navigation, a legal principle that states that ships from any country have the right to sail freely in international waters, well, that's under attack. So, over the course of a special two-part podcast, I'm going to take a wider look at these issues and what it means for shipping. Is freedom of navigation, a fundamental principle of the law of the sea and a pillar of modern international law, something that we've just quietly given up on? Well, there's a couple of different vectors that are certainly interfering with it, even if you don't necessarily agree with the fact that it is under threat. So I'm going to try and separate those out to start with. One is primarily legal and political, and the other one is fairly obviously physical. And when we're looking at the physical threat to freedom of navigation, well, the obvious place to start is in the Red Sea.
The physical one with the Houthis is quite worrying because the level of violence towards commercial maritime shipping was really quite distinctive over the last year and a bit. And I think what it showed was just how capable a coastal area could be in overwhelming the capacity of the world's best navies to actually provide security for commercial shipping.
That voice is one that should be fairly familiar to regular podcast listeners. It's Ian Ralby, chief executive of the consultancy IR Consilium, and his work at the heart of not just the Red Sea situation, but many other maritime hotspots has led him to the conclusion that freedom of navigation is very much under threat. As you'll hear, that's not a unanimous view, but let's just hear him out on this issue of the nature of the physical threat to shipping and why, despite a ceasefire in Gaza, it's still the Houthi threat that is calling the shots on whether shipping can return to so-called normal operations.
That lesson has already started to translate elsewhere, and I have great concern that we'll see inspiration popping up both through the network that the Houthis have made through their success, but also in other ways. I mean, I think the Russians have learned a lot from the Houthis, and some have tried to sell me on the notion that they've learned about drone technology, and I think that's absolutely farcical and ridiculous. Though the Russians have been experiencing the Ukrainian innovation on the drone technology for quite a while, long before the Houthis started their attacks, and so that was not new to them. But what they did learn is that the shipping community can be targeted, can be hit, can be disrupted with very little, if any, consequence. And that's what we've started to see in the Black Sea over the last few months, where there have been several attacks against commercial vessels, quite violent attacks, more so than at any other point during the invasion since February 22. And yet there's been no real blowback against the Russians. So that lesson is now visible in at least two different contexts. And unfortunately, that provides great inspiration for those who might want to be disruptive or gain the kind of attention that the Houthis have somewhere else.
Okay, so the physical risk to shipping is certainly heightened, and the actions of the Houthis have rather exposed the vulnerabilities of maritime choke points. But trade has been disrupted before, and it's recovered. Granted, the rather lackluster naval support on offer does raise some pretty serious questions, but taken in isolation, this doesn't really challenge the nature of the freedom of navigation. Here's Dominic Donald, a geopolitical consultant and analyst, an advisor to the Joint War Risk Committee at Lloyd since 2004, so he knows his stuff. He disagrees with the suggestion that freedom of navigation is under attack.
Yes, I think that would be overacting it. I think if you look at what was happening in the Red Sea, for instance, I think naval power has been used to try to assert freedom of navigation. And in fact, I'd argue that it's been pretty effective in that it has managed to keep the Red Sea open, has managed to keep the Gulf of Aden open. And the fact that the Houthis sort of attacks have fallen off significantly in number is in part a function of that naval effort. So there you've got an attempt to assert freedom of navigation, which I think has been actually fairly successful. You might well argue that what's beginning to appear in the Baltic with Russian so-called shadow fleet tankers under threat of detention is also freedom of navigation, in as much as these vessels that are suspected of carrying out attacks on marine infrastructure are also, it appears, extremely dodgy. And I think any literal state might argue that a ship going through its territorial waters, or indeed just its EEZ, that is simply one bump away from spilling 100,000 gallons of oil on some shore, actually poses a risk to freedom of navigation, not least if it's underinsured. I think what one sees in the Taiwan Straits is much more contentious. And people might say that's because of where I sit in terms of where I come from and in terms of my background. But I think it is true that China is trying to restrict, or at least be able to restrict and control, traffic through the Taiwan Straits and then also in certain areas of the South China Seas for its own political purposes. What one's seeing in other areas is perhaps what seems a little more kind of traditional, almost. A local difficulty that for a moment, in the great span of historical time, that for a moment spills out into seaways, threatens traffic. Action is taken that then either reasserts the freedom of navigation or fails, but that then leads to further actions. I mean, that's kind of within the normal frame of reference, I would argue. I would suggest that what China is doing in the South China Sea and in the Taiwan Straits is not like that. But having said that, once China, and we're just positing that China might succeed in its attempts to regain Taiwan, once China regains Taiwan, China might well then be a complete advocate of complete freedom of navigation once more and open up those waterways. So if one's looking at the great span of time and one's looking forward 10 or 15 years to a situation where hypothetically China has succeeded in regaining Taiwan, we could actually look at what China's doing now in the waters off Taiwan and in the South China Sea as one of those kind of inbuilt blips that pop up, affect a seaway, and then over time they get resolved and normal traffic resumes.
We're going to come back to China shortly because in addition to the Taiwan Strait issue outlined there by Dominic, there is an arguably more significant and sustained legal and political threat being posed to the concept of freedom of navigation by China. But I want to pause there to reinforce the point that we are not just talking about an escalation of physical threats for shipping. That has happened in the past and no doubt will continue to be a reality of globalized trade. What we're talking about here is a much more specific threat to the rules-based order upon which global maritime trade relies. Back to Dominic.
Having said all of that, I think there is an issue about the geopolitical impact on shipping more widely as an issue. I think it is very much the case that ship owners and operators and flag states are coming under pressure, usually exercised through the sanctions regime, or at least enforced through a sanctions regime. But actually, there's an awful lot of backstage discussion, backstage influence that's exerted before sanctions come in, and also around sanctions. So, sanctions in a sense are just the tip of the iceberg that people see. There's a whole lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that people don't see. That activity is very much geared towards shutting down one state's ability to do one or more particular things. And the fact that the state, the sanctioned state, is trying to find loopholes, get out of the constraints that are being placed upon it, and is doing that by taking advantage of all of the messiness of the global maritime system, where you've got flag states that may not actually have a coastline. You've got single ship ownership vehicles based in effectively not very much legal oversight jurisdictions. They're exploiting all of that messiness to get around the sanctions that are being imposed. That then exposes the system as a whole to pressure that may be exercised through sanctions, but is certainly going to be exercised through the discussions and so on around sanctions. And so that, I think, is a new phenomenon for the shipping world in general. And I think there is an extra aspect of this that makes it quite difficult for the shipping world in general, and is likely to for at least another few years. And that is that the core dispute that's driving this at present, which is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this is not seen by the states that are applying sanctions as a cost of doing international business kind of cause. This is right and wrong. Russia is wrong, Ukraine is right, and therefore those who are trying to ensure Ukraine can turn back Russia are also in the right. And that adds a moral element to the attempts to influence the shipping world that means both that the efforts are that much more intense, and secondly, that they're likely to be longer lasting. So I think we are in a situation where I would suggest that perhaps the freedom of navigation is not directly under threat, but the old way of doing business for the shipping world as a whole might be under threat. And of course, it is then possible, once you posit that, it's then possible that in turn might mean threats to freedom of navigation, where certain states further down the road might take it upon themselves to routinely challenge vessels that are flying a certain flag or that are owned by a certain company. And that, I think, would be a more tricky development. But I don't think we're there yet. It'll be very interesting to see how the Shadow Fleet issue in the Baltic plays out.
I'm going to go into a little bit more depth into the Baltic situation and the legal details in UNCLOS, the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, in the next edition of the podcast. But I just wanted to introduce another voice here, Professor Kristin Sigg. Now, Kristin is a leading academic voice on the law of the sea, and her interpretation of whether Baltic states' attempts to protect themselves against the recent spate of cable-cutting incidents and dark fleet threats, that's important. But before we come to that, I asked her whether she thinks, overall, freedom of navigation is under threat.
No, I don't think it is, but then I think it was never as free as we praise it to be. I think a lot of these issues have been there in different contexts, some of them for a long time. But I don't think they've been acted so much in the general public eye. It's been a lot of these, maybe not the situation as now, because a lot of things are going on at the same time, we perceive. But the sort of narrative of freedom of navigation was always, well, that's a merchant narrative. And then we hit the geopolitical security realities of what goes on where. And it was always like that. But I don't think it was spoken much about outside of immediate shipping circles. So I think what is different now is that politicians or legislators that are not normally invested in the shipping world, some suddenly start taking a stance here. And from a legal point of view, it seems it starts to become about something else, which is also well and good in a way because it always was about something else. The security situation at sea is always about something else than the actual shipping. So, but that is also what makes it a little bit difficult to maybe sometimes to get the message across, because what is what? If you have an increased tense security situation in a part of the sea or in a part of our oceans, that will, of course, rub off on the people using that ocean. What we have seen maybe that is different is both with the piracy in 2008-9 and going forward, but also with the Houthi situation in the Red Sea now, is maybe some of the people that we think are a threat to this navigation seem to be better equipped to be that threat. It seems to be more organized. It took a lot of organization to actually effectively do what the Somali pirates did back in the 8 and 9s and going forward from that. It takes, of course, an almost state-like entity like the Houthis to actually, well, one could say wage war on shipping. That, to me, is different than before.
Okay, so I said at the start that this wasn't just about the physical threat to shipping, and I think that's an important point to be making here. I'm going to take you back a few weeks from the point that this edition of the podcast is going out to the point at which a ceasefire deal in Gaza was being announced. This is significant. The Houthis are holding Red Sea shipping to ransom notionally in solidarity with the Palestinians, but in reality to extract income and exert influence over the region. But a few hours before that ceasefire deal in Gaza was announced, the UN Security Council was once again grappling with the Houthi threat to shipping in the Red Sea. And on the table was yet another resolution. The resolution was demanding that the Houthis immediately cease all attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea, and an unnamed member state, it was Iran, stop providing arms to the Houthis. Now, opposition from China and Russia is pretty much par for the course in such discussions, but the detail of why China intervened this time bears closer examination in the context of this discussion that we're having today. It seems that China's biggest beef was with the language in the original draft from Greece that contained those contentious 3 words: freedom of navigation. Now, we know that language on maritime security is a pretty sensitive issue for China at the UN, thanks to its interests in the South China Seas. The fact that the US, a fellow Security Council member, has sent fleets to the South China Sea, citing the need to assert the freedom of navigation, is, diplomatically speaking, something of a sticky issue. So in an apparent compromise, the resolution ended up not mentioning either threats to freedom of navigation, supply chains, provision of humanitarian aid, or the environment. Instead, it generically recalled the importance of maritime security. That was it. Such diplomatic semantics, of course, would ordinarily be of pretty much no significance to anybody other than UN legal spots. But given the increasing restrictions on global shipping drawn down geopolitical lines, these 3 words are more important than ever. Russia's saber-rattling over freedom of navigation restrictions for dark fleet vessels in the Baltic are politically volatile, but they need to be taken seriously. Both China and Russia have been making noises about how they don't view the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea as the single authoritative source on the law of the sea. Basically, everything from the Taiwan Strait to the future of the Arctic is at stake in this diplomatic semantic argument. If that rhetoric from Russia and China turns to action and they withdraw from a treaty that they believe is no longer fit for its purpose, and China then follows, I grant you, 2 very big ifs from where we stand right now, but if they did, it would spell the end of the current near-global consensus on the governance of the oceans. A UN resolution on the Houthis does little to change the current situation on the water, namely that despite a tentative ceasefire in Gaza, the threat assessment for shipping remains pretty much unchanged as of the point of this podcast. Vessels at the moment are not returning to the Red Sea. But the fact that freedom of navigation is now seen as a diplomatic bargaining chip to be deleted for the purpose of compromise should be worrying us all. And I'm not the only one who's worried. Back to Ian Rowby.
What I'm starting to see around the world is an effort under the guise of sovereignty to curtail freedom of navigation in different ways, whether it's exercising excessive control over fishing vessels moving through an area even though they're not fishing, whether it is trying to exert excessive territorial claims, whether it is trying to make claims that have no basis in international maritime law. For example, China not only has built artificial islands and declared both a territorial sea and an exclusive economic zone around them, which is anathema to UNCLOS. They've also claimed that they can exclude foreign warships and warplanes from the exclusive economic zone, which has no basis in international maritime law whatsoever and would constitute a major decrease not only in freedom of navigation, but the ability of many states to provide safe transit through the South China Sea. They could essentially, if China exercised that proclaimed right, could close the South China Sea to anyone they wanted to. And that is a major transit corridor with trillions of dollars of economic activity that would be put in jeopardy. And what's scary is they're starting to, I think, chip away. There's a movement by the likes of China, by Russia, by Iran, by others to start moving the law towards their interpretation of it. And China is at the forefront of this with huge numbers of publications that serve their interests and thus create potentially new international law, but at the same time, statements and diplomatic efforts to get others to agree with them. So there's a growing number of states, for example, that do not recognize the ability of a foreign navy to conduct military exercises in the exclusive economic zone. Most states on Earth agree that, there's no problem with, no matter what country they're from, a live fire exercise in the exclusive economic zone of any country. But that is being eroded by this notion that there's some kind of sovereign right over the exclusive economic zone that has not actually been enshrined in UNCLOS. And so that growing number from 17 to more now states all starting to say, no, that is not a right under UNCLOS. You must get permission, not even just notice, but get permission, is a growing issue. In the same vein, the notion of innocent passage has eroded, and there are a growing number of states that believe that there must be notice given for innocent passage.
Okay, we have an extraordinary and unusual series of physical threats to shipping curtailing the ability of ships to transit key trade lanes. We have a political push by key states to undermine the universal nature of the law of the sea. And of course, we have all of that taking place amid increasing protectionism and a looming trade war. But how robust is the concept of freedom of navigation, legally speaking? And what protections can coastal states employ to defend against the threat of the Dark Fleet without undermining the very rules-based order they are seeking to uphold? All good questions, and all will be tackled in the next edition of the podcast, which will pick up where I'm leaving this one. So make sure you come back and listen to part 2.